Imagine this. You're on the most luxurious ship ever built, a floating palace. You've just finished a lavish dinner, the string quartet is still playing, and the Atlantic is calm as glass. Then, without warning, everything stops. No crash. No screech of tearing metal. Just silence. And in that moment your life changes forever. Over 100 years later, the tragedy of the Titanic still grips our imaginations. We've all heard the story. A proud ship meets a deadly iceberg, the unsinkable marvel sinks into the freezing Black Sea. But what if that's not the whole truth? What if the iceberg was never the true villain? This isn't just wild speculation. Survivors themselves told stories that don't line up with the official version. Eyewitness accounts of eerie stops, strange explosions, and mysterious lights on the horizon still send chills down our spines. And some theories go even further, suggesting sabotage, cover-ups, and one of the biggest frauds in maritime history. Let's go back to that cold April night in 1912. One man's testimony has become the heartbeat of the mystery. His name was Frank Prentice, assistant purser aboard the Titanic. He was a man trained for order, for protocol, for calm in crisis. But decades later, when he told his story on camera, he fought back tears. There was no impact as such, he said. It was just like jamming your brakes on a car and that was that. She stopped. Think about that. The world has always imagined this dramatic collision, a monstrous wall of ice smashing into steel. But for those aboard, there was no violent jolt. No bone-shaking crunch. Just a sudden dead stop. Prentice had been in his cabin when it happened. The porthole was open. The sky was crystal clear. Stars shimmered above a calm, endless ocean. He saw no iceberg. No damage. No cause for alarm. But the Titanic, the pride of the White Star Line, was dead in the water. Orders came quickly. Prentice was told to fetch biscuits for the lifeboats. By the time he returned, the ship was already listing. Passengers were uneasy. Crew members were tense. And then, he heard it. 4 deep, muffled booms echoing from somewhere far below. Not the scraping of ice. Not the groan of stressed metal. These were explosions. Were they ruptured boilers? Steam pipes giving way? Or were they something far worse, something intentional? Prentice didn't have time to figure it out. Minutes later, he was thrown into the freezing Atlantic, hitting the surface with what he called a terrific crack. Only his life belt, and what he described as the grace of God, kept him alive until a lifeboat pulled him in. And he was not alone. Multiple survivors testified before the U.S. Senate that there had been no violent impact. Just a subtle vibration. An odd, sudden stop. And then, strange noises inside the ship. If the iceberg wasn't felt, could something else have fatally damaged the Titanic from within? Some point to faulty engineering, cheap rivets, brittle steel, or a fire in a coal bunker that had been burning for days before the voyage. Others whisper about deliberate sabotage, meant to look like an accident. And then there's the most infamous theory of all, the Olympic switch. To understand it, we need to step back a year before the disaster. In 1911, Titanic's nearly identical sister ship, the RMS Olympic, collided with the Royal Navy cruiser HMS Hawke. The crash tore open the Olympic's hull and damaged her keel. Repairs were costly, insurers refused to pay, and White Star Line was staring down a financial disaster. According to the theory, the solution was simple and diabolical. Switch the ships. The damaged Olympic would be disguised as the Titanic, while the real Titanic, still pristine, would quietly take the Olympic's name. The worn, compromised vessel would then accidentally sink on her maiden voyage, allowing the company to collect insurance money and cut their losses. Believers point to odd clues. The Titanic was designed with 14 portholes along one section of the forward sea deck, but when she sailed, photos showed 16, just like the Olympic. Interior details also didn't match original blueprints. And then there was financier J.P. Morgan, who owned the company behind White Star Line. He had reserved a private suite for the maiden voyage, complete with his own personal promenade deck. But at the last minute he cancelled, claiming illness, only to be spotted relaxing at a French resort. Could Morgan have known something was about to happen? Could the Titanic's fate have been sealed before she even left port? Critics argue the theory doesn't hold water. The logistics of secretly swapping 2 massive ocean liners in a matter of days are staggering. Serial numbers engraved throughout the ship's structure, differing floor plans, and hundreds of workers would make the deception nearly impossible. And when the wreck was discovered in 1985, identifying marks confirmed it was indeed the Titanic lying on the ocean floor. Still, for many, the idea refuses to die. It's the perfect storm of mystery, money, and human ambition. If a corporation could sacrifice a ship, and the lives on it, for profit, what else might it have done to ensure the plan succeeded? Could the explosions Frank Prentice heard have been part of that plan? And what about the searchlight? Survivors in lifeboats, including Prentice, saw a light on the horizon, a ship close enough to see them. They signaled for help. It never came. Official history tells us this was likely the Californian, a nearby vessel whose crew failed to grasp the Titanic's distress. But some believe it was no accident. Was another ship positioned nearby not to rescue survivors, but to watch the Titanic go down? If that's true, then the tragedy wasn't just a maritime disaster. It was murder. Of course, even without conspiracy theories, the Titanic story is one of failure, of human arrogance, corporate greed, and the fatal belief that nature could be outclassed. But when you add survivor testimony that contradicts the official story, when you factor in strange noises, unexplained decisions, and the shadow of powerful men who dodged the voyage, the picture gets murkier. Frank Prentice never claimed to have the answers. But his doubt, his lingering suspicion, has survived more than a century. You lie in bed at night, he said, and the whole thing comes round again. And maybe that's the point. The Titanic disaster isn't just history. It's a reminder of how easily truth can sink into the depths, covered over by the official record, until only fragments remain, bits of steel, a few haunting testimonies, and the questions that refuse to die. Was it really just an iceberg on a cold April night? Or was the tragedy something far darker, planned, executed, and buried beneath the waves? As we remember those who were lost, we also have to confront the uncomfortable truth. History is often written by those who survive it, and sometimes they leave out the most important parts. If this story has made you rethink what you thought you knew about the Titanic, if it's made you question the official narrative, then don't let the conversation end here. Keep asking questions. Keep digging. And keep the memory of those who were aboard alive, not just as victims, but as witnesses to a truth we may never fully uncover. And if you want more deep dives into history's most enduring mysteries, make sure you subscribe, tap that bell, and share this video with someone who loves a good story. Because sometimes the truth isn't found in the history books, it's found in the voices that refuse to stay silent. Some people believe the fate of the Titanic was sealed long before it touched the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Not by bad weather, nor by human error, but by a calculated decision at the very top. A decision that would sacrifice a doomed ship, bury its secrets in the deep, and quietly allow powerful interests to carry on untouched. Supporters of this idea point to tiny, almost imperceptible differences between the Titanic and its sister ship, the Olympic. Photographs from the time reveal variations in window arrangements, deck layouts, and other structural details that don't quite match the original Titanic blueprints. Repair records from the shipyard are confusing, overlapping in places, and even testimonies from crew members hint that something wasn't right. Some former workers and sailors claimed there were whispers of suspicion before the voyage even began. A few booked to travel on the Titanic mysteriously canceled at the last moment. Others came aboard with religious texts or lucky charms clutched tightly in hand, as though they sensed something dreadful lay ahead. It's this blend of subtle evidence and strange behavior that conspiracy theorists cling to. Yet not everyone is convinced. Maritime historians like Gareth Russell and Kent Leighton have dismissed the theory outright, arguing that swapping two almost identical, but not perfectly identical, ships in total secrecy would have been near impossible. They point out that the Olympic and Titanic differed in promenade configurations, interior trim work, and engine room design. Pulling off such a deception would have required thousands of engineers, inspectors, and crew to remain silent for life. Even more damning, they say, is the financial logic, or lack of it. The insurance payout for Titanic's sinking wouldn't have come close to covering the replacement cost of the Olympic. That makes the supposed motive far weaker than many believers would like to think. And yet, the theory refuses to die. Like so many conspiracy stories, it survives because it mixes real historical events with unanswered questions, giving just enough room for human imagination to take over. Whether it's true or not almost becomes secondary. Its persistence is fueled by something deeper, a public suspicion of powerful corporations, and a belief that behind every major tragedy lies a carefully hidden agenda. But for some, the Titanic's doom had less to do with boardroom schemes and more to do with forces far older, far darker, and far more supernatural. Among the passengers was William Stead, a respected British journalist and editor, known for his fearless writing and his fascination with the supernatural. While many on board were thinking only of the luxury and excitement of their voyage, Stead brought with him a chilling story, one that would become forever linked to the Titanic's legend. It was the tale of an Egyptian mummy's curse. According to Stead, the artifact was no ordinary relic. It was the coffin lid of an ancient high priestess, unearthed from a tomb along the Nile and rumored to bring death and disaster to any who dared disturb it. In the years before the Titanic's voyage, strange events seemed to follow it wherever it went. Guards at the British Museum, where the lid was kept, reportedly abandoned their posts in fear. Curators fell ill. A journalist who touched it was said to have died shortly after under mysterious circumstances. Stead claimed that the coffin lid had recently been sold to a wealthy American, and that it was being transported to New York aboard the Titanic. To him, it was no coincidence. The relic had already left a trail of misfortune, and now it was crossing the ocean, aboard a ship widely believed to be unsinkable. He told the tale to fellow first-class passengers as an after-dinner thrill, but his conviction in the story was real. No one imagined that within days, they would be fighting for their lives in freezing waters, the story taking on a sinister new light. After the tragedy, the press seized on the mummy's curse. Survivors repeated Stead's account to eager reporters, and soon newspapers were filled with lurid headlines. Some claimed the mummy had been smuggled aboard and hidden among priceless artifacts in the first-class cargo. Others insisted it had been placed deep in the hold, away from prying eyes. The truth, however, is far more ordinary. Museum records prove the coffin lid never left London in 1912. In fact, it wasn't even a true mummy, just a painted wooden board from a burial chamber, surrounded by decades of tall tales. Yet the curse story took hold because it offered something cold facts could not, a sense of cosmic justice. It suggested the disaster was no mere accident but punishment. A symbol of opulence and imperial pride had been struck down for disturbing the sacred. And in a world struggling to understand how such a perfect ship could sink on its first voyage, the story gave the tragedy an almost moral dimension. But not every theory about the Titanic's fate was wrapped in mysticism. Some were rooted in hard-nosed power politics, and one of the most enduring involves a name as big as the ship itself, J.P. Morgan. By 1912, John Pierpont Morgan was already one of the most powerful men in the world. He controlled railroads, steel, banking, electricity, and the White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic. Morgan had even reserved a lavish suite on the ship, complete with private promenade and cigar holders. He attended its launch the year before, publicly praising it as a triumph of modern engineering. And then at the last minute he canceled his trip. Officially, he decided to remain in France for health treatments at a luxurious spa, massages, mineral baths, quiet relaxation. But conspiracy theorists see something more deliberate in that decision. Three of Morgan's most influential opponents in American finance, John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus, were on board the Titanic. All three were known to oppose the creation of a centralized banking system in the United States. And all three would perish when the ship went down. Just over a year later, in December 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was passed, creating the central bank Morgan had long supported. To believers in the theory, the timing is more than coincidence. They argue that removing these powerful men cleared the way for Morgan and his allies to shape the financial future of America. Critics, of course, are quick to dismantle this claim. They point out there's no evidence the three men could have stopped the Federal Reserve, nor any direct link between Morgan and the disaster. His absence from the voyage could simply have been a matter of personal preference. And orchestrating one of history's worst maritime tragedies to eliminate political rivals would have been an extraordinarily risky and unpredictable plan. Still, suspicion lingers, because Morgan's reputation fits the role perfectly. He was a man who played the long game, who made ruthless decisions when they served his interests. And in the world of high finance, where fortunes shift with a single signature, people have learned to expect that almost anything is possible. In the end, whether you believe the Titanic was sunk by corporate fraud, a pharaoh's curse, or cold economic ambition, one thing is certain: the tragedy left behind more than just wreckage on the ocean floor. It left a story so vast, so compelling that more than a century later we're still telling it, still arguing over what really happened. Because maybe, deep down, people don't just want an answer. They want a mystery that never fully closes. A reminder that the world's greatest disasters might not be accidents at all. The idea that J.P. Morgan might have orchestrated the Titanic's demise to cement his influence and quietly remove powerful opposition has never been supported by hard evidence. Yet, like so many conspiracy narratives, it refuses to fade. Each time a new coincidence surfaces or a forgotten document is unearthed, the whispers grow louder. People connect dots that official history keeps apart, painting a picture of events far more deliberate than accidental. And if Morgan didn't need an iceberg to eliminate rivals, it begs another question. What if there was never an iceberg at all? For over a century the accepted story has been simple. The Titanic struck a massive iceberg, tore open its hull and sank. But Captain L.M. Collins, a veteran ice expert with decades of experience navigating frozen seas, believed that history had it wrong. His theory was bold. The Titanic, he argued, never collided with a towering block of ice. Instead, it grazed through a deadly field of pack ice, a flat, sprawling expanse of hardened Arctic ice that is far more deceptive. Unlike the iconic image of a jagged peak looming in the darkness, pack ice sits low in the water, almost invisible under calm seas and cold air. Collins wasn't some armchair historian looking for attention. He had served in a specialist British unit dedicated to studying sea ice and its effects on vessels. Drawing on that expertise, he combed through survivor testimonies, searching for inconsistencies in the traditional iceberg narrative. He found them. Witnesses could not agree on what they had seen. Some described an iceberg soaring as high as 60 feet above the waves. Others, like 4th Officer Joseph Boxhall, swore the object was barely visible above the surface. Such drastic differences in accounts hinted at something far stranger than one solid wall of ice. The key, Collins believed, was a phenomenon known as superrefraction. In extremely cold conditions, light bends in unusual ways, distorting perception across vast distances. A flat sheet of ice could appear to float higher than it really was, shimmer oddly, or vanish into the horizon. What looked like a menacing iceberg to one person might seem like nothing more than a pale haze to another. Collins argued that the white glow described by the men in the crow's nest wasn't fog at all, but the leading edge of a wide pack ice field, a frozen minefield stretching across the Titanic's path, waiting for the ship to sail blindly into it. But perhaps Collins' most daring challenge to the iceberg story came from physics. He pointed to the Burgee effect, which suggests that if a ship moving at full speed were to strike an immense iceberg head-on, the force of impact would cause the ice to roll, pivot, or even split apart. It would not result in a slow, scraping wound along the side. More importantly, such a direct collision would have likely sunk the Titanic within minutes. Yet, the great liner stayed afloat for nearly 3 hours, its wounds spreading water slowly but relentlessly. To Collins, that long survival window meant the hull was not ripped open in one catastrophic instant. Instead, he imagined the ship slicing against jagged, low-lying ice over and over again, each strike creating a new gash. This would explain why so many survivors recalled hearing a grinding, tearing sound rather than the deafening crash one would expect from a single massive impact. Some passengers, like Seaman Frank Prentice, even reported noises deep in the ship that sounded like a chain of explosions, structural failures that could match the damage caused by repeated glancing blows. Modern explorations of the wreck add a strange credibility to his view. Sonar scans and underwater photography show not one continuous tear, but multiple points of localized damage scattered along the starboard bow. These punctures match the pattern Collins predicted: wounds from a slow, slicing contact with uneven ice, not the neat devastation of a clean break. If that's true, the towering iceberg immortalized in paintings, books, and films might have been little more than a supporting player in the disaster, its role exaggerated by a century of retelling. But Collins' theory leads to another uncomfortable thought. If pack ice really was to blame, could something else have made the Titanic unusually vulnerable to it that night? Something that began weakening her long before she entered those frozen waters? Hidden beneath the decks, away from the eyes of her first-class passengers, there may have been a second disaster already in progress. Deep in the ship's belly, inside one of her enormous coal bunkers, a fire was burning. Reports suggest it had been smoldering for days before Titanic even left Southampton. Fires in coal bunkers weren't unheard of on steamships in that era. The pressure and heat from the stored coal could cause spontaneous combustion. But this wasn't a minor blaze. This one was reportedly burning against the inner hull, on the same side the ship would later scrape against the ice. Some engineers believe the heat could have reached such extremes that it weakened the steel itself, leaving it far more vulnerable to any impact. The crew knew about the fire. Stokers and firemen worked in brutal conditions to contain it, shoveling the burning coal straight into the furnaces to both feed the engines and reduce the danger. Ironically, this effort may have created a new problem. The more coal they burned, the faster the Titanic went, even as warnings of ice ahead came streaming in from other ships. If the fire was pushing the crew to maintain speed to clear the bunker, it might have played a silent hand in setting the perfect stage for disaster. One photograph taken before departure appears to show a long, dark streak on the Titanic's hull, in the same location the fire was said to have raged. Some experts believe this is visible heat damage captured by chance. Others, like Titanic historian Samuel Halpern, dismiss the idea entirely. Halpern argues that the ship's design was strong enough to handle a localized fire, and that the iceberg, whatever its shape, remained the true culprit. Still, the coincidence of the fire's location, the unusual speed, and the nature of the hull's failure keeps the theory alive. It is possible the Titanic was doomed by more than just the cold. The fire, if it truly compromised her structure, may have made survival impossible the moment steel met ice. In that sense, the iceberg, or the pack ice, might have merely finished what the flames had already begun. And even if the fire did not directly cause the sinking, its influence on the ship's speed and the crew's decisions could have been just as fatal. There is a symbolism in this that is hard to ignore. A fire burned in the ship's heart, unseen by her passengers. Another burned in the minds of her owners and officers, a fire of ambition, of pride, of the unshakable belief that the Titanic was unsinkable. There was a desire to impress the world, to arrive ahead of schedule, to prove that man's engineering had finally mastered nature. Both fires, one literal and one figurative, went unchecked. And in the end, both may have played their part in dragging the great ship to the bottom of the Atlantic. Over a century later, the questions remain. Was the Titanic brought down by a lone iceberg as history books insist? Or did she fall victim to a combination of human error, hidden mechanical weakness, and misunderstood natural forces? Was it sabotage, mistaken identity, or an invisible enemy lurking just beneath the waves? The truth may never be fully known. The wreck lies silent, its secrets buried in darkness 2.5 miles below the surface. Yet the fascination endures because the Titanic is more than a ship. She is a story, of human triumph and human failure, of nature's quiet power, and of mysteries that refuse to be settled. And perhaps that's why we keep searching for answers, even when history tells us the case is closed.